The Norwegian Civil War Era is a term used for the period in the history of Norway between 1130 to 1240. During this time a series of civil wars were fought between rival kings and pretenders to the throne. The reasons for the wars is one of the most debated topics in Norwegian medieval history. The goal of the warring parties was always to put a man on the throne, starting with the death of King Sigurd the Crusader in 1130, a supposedly adored monarch. In the first decades of the Civil Wars, alliances shifted and centered on the person of a king or pretender, but eventually, towards the end of the 12th century, two rival parties emerged, known as the Birkebeiner and the Bagler. After these two parties were reconciled in 1217, a more ordered system of government centered on the king was gradually able to bring an end to the frequent risings. The failed rising of Duke Skalbardsson in 1240 was the final event of the Civil War era. Events of the Civil War era. Background: the unification of Norway into one kingdom is traditionally held to have been achieved by King Harald Fairhair at the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872, but the process of unification took a long time to complete and consolidate. By the mid-11th century the process seems to have been completed. However, it was still not uncommon for several rulers to share the kingship. This seems to have been the common way of solving disputes in cases where two or more worthy candidates for the throne existed. The relationship between such co-rulers was often tense, but open conflict was generally averted. Clear succession laws did not exist. The main criterion for being considered a worthy candidate for the throne was to be a descendant of Harald Fairhair through the male line. Legitimate or illegitimate birth was not an issue. King Sigurd the Crusader had also shared the kingdom with his brothers, King Eystein and King Olav, but when they both died without issue, Sigurd became sole ruler and his son, Magnus, heir apparent. However, in the late 1120s a man called Harald Gillekrist arrived in Norway from Ireland, claiming to be a son of King Sigurd's father, King Magnus Barefoot. King Magnus had spent some time campaigning in Ireland, and Harald would thus be King Sigurd's half-brother. Harald proved his case through an ordeal of fire, the common way of settling such claims at the time, and King Sigurd recognized him as his brother. However, Harald had to swear an oath that he would not claim the title of king as long as Sigurd, his son, was alive. Succession to Sigurd the Crusader. When Sigurd died in 1130, Harald broke his oath. Sigurd's son Magnus was proclaimed king, but Harald also claimed the royal title, and received much support. A settlement was reached whereby Magnus and Harald would both be kings and co-rulers. Peace between them lasted until 1134, when open war broke out. In 1135 Harald succeeded in defeating and capturing Magnus in Bergen. Magnus was blinded, castrated, mutilated and imprisoned in a monastery. He was thereafter known as Magnus the Blind. At about the same time Sigurd Slembe, another man from Ireland, arrived claiming to be a son of Magnus Barefoot. He claimed to have gone through an ordeal by fire in Denmark to prove his claim. Harald did not recognize him as his half-brother. In 1136 Sigurd murdered Harald in his sleep in Bergen, and had himself proclaimed king. Harald's supporters would not accept him and had Harald's two infant sons, Sigurd Munn and Inge Crouchback, named king. Sigurd Slembe liberated Magnus the Blind from his enforced monastic life and allied himself with him. The war between Sigurd Slembe and Magnus the Blind on the one side, and Harald Gill's old supporters with his young sons on the other, dragged on until 1139, when Magnus and Sigurd were defeated in Battle of Holmengra fort near Havela. Magnus was killed in the battle. Sigurd was captured and tortured to death. Harald Gill's sons. The power sharing between Sigurd Munn and Inge Crouchback functioned well as long as they were both minors. In 1142, once again, a king's son arrived in Norway from west of the North Sea. This time it was Øystein Haraldsson, a son of Harald Jarl. Øystein claimed part of his father's inheritance and was given the title of king, with a third of the kingdom. The three brothers ruled together, apparently in peace, until 1155. According to the sagas, Øystein and Sigurd Munn laid plans to depose the brother Inge and divide his share of the kingdom between them. At the urging of his mother Ingrid Ranvaldsdottir and the influential Lendman Gregorius Dagson, Inge decided to strike first. At a meeting among the three kings in Bergen, Sigurd Munn was attacked and killed by Inge's men before Øystein had had time to arrive in the city. Inge and Øystein then reached a tenuous settlement, but conditions between them soon deteriorated into open warfare, ending with Øystein's capture and murder in Bohuslän in 1157. Whether or not Inge himself ordered the killing of his brother seems to have been disputed at the time. The followers of Inge's dead brothers, Øystein and Sigurd Munn, were not inclined to submit to Inge and instead chose a new pretender, Sigurd Munn's son, Håkon the Broad-Shouldered. This development has been seen as the first sign of a new stage in the civil wars. The warring parties no longer simply sprung up around a king, a pretender, but stayed together after the fall of the leader and elected a new figurehead, heralding the formation of more firmly organized warring factions. A figurehead is all that Håkon could have been in 1157, as he was only 10 years old. However, his followers had him named king and continued the fight against Inge. In 1161 they succeeded in killing Inge in battle in Oslo. Magnus Ellingson and the church. In 1161 Inge's followers took the same course of action as Øystein's followers had 4 years earlier and elected a new figurehead rather than submit to Håkon. The choice fell upon the 5-year-old Magnus Ellingson, the son of one of the most prominent leaders, the Lendman Erlingskake, by his wife Kristen, daughter of King Sigurd the Crusader. Erling, with the title Jarl, became the real leader of the faction. The next year they succeeded in defeating and killing Håkon in battle at Sekun in the Romsdalsfjord. The year after that another son of Sigurd Munn, Sigurd Markasfuster, who had been set up as a new pretender against Magnus Erlingsson, was captured by Erlingskake and killed in Bergen. The action of Erling and the rest of his party in electing Magnus Erlingsson as the leader was a radical one, as it broke with one of the traditional principles of who might become king. Magnus was not a king's son. He was only descended from the ancient royal line through his mother. To compensate for this shortcoming, Erling and Magnus's party allied themselves with the church and introduced a new criterion. The king should henceforth be of legitimate birth. Their old leader, Inge Crouchback, had been the only one of the sons of Harald Jarl to be legitimate, and King Magnus Erlingsson was also Erling and Kristine's legitimate son. The alliance with the church, which had recently become better organized in Norway after the establishment of a separate Norwegian archdiocese in Nidaros in 1152, became an important asset for Erling and Magnus. In 1163 in Bergen, Magnus Erlingsson became the first Norwegian king to be crowned. Aged 7. A written law of succession was also introduced which only allowed the oldest legitimate son to inherit. For the next decade or so, Magnus Erlingsson's position as king, with Erlingskake as the real leader of the country, seemed secure. Erling ruthlessly eliminated any potential rivals to his son. He was also allied at times with King Valdemar I of Denmark, and according to one source he at one time took the Oslo area as a fief from him. However, the extent of his subordination to Denmark is questionable. King Sverre and the rise of the Birkebeiner. In 1174 a new faction arose in rebellion against Magnus Ellingson. The leader was the young Øystein Møller, son of Øystein Haraldsson. This new faction was called the Birkebeiner, meaning birch legs, because some of them were so poor that they wound birch bark around the legs instead of proper footwear. Øystein Møller was killed by Magnus and Erling's men at the Battle of Ree in 1177. Soon after, the Birkebeiner made Sverre Sigurdsson the leader. Sverre had come to Norway from the Faroe Islands and claimed to have recently discovered that he was in fact the son of King Sigurd Munn. His claim was widely disbelieved at the time. However, after taking over leadership of the Birkebeiner, he became a rallying point for everyone disgruntled with the rule of Erling Skoger and King Magnus. Some materialists among modern historians have tried to read a form of class struggle into Sverre and the Birkebeiner's fight against Erling and Magnus. However, the extent to which Sverre's men actually represented the impoverished strata of the population remains disputed. It is clear that most of the Lent men, the nobility of the time, sided with King Magnus, but Sverre also quickly won several of them over to his side. In any event, the Birkebeiner did not try to change the social order of society. They merely wanted to place themselves at its top. In 1179 Sverre won an important victory in the battle at Kalvskinnet on the outskirts of Nidaros, where Erling Skakke was killed. For that point, the Trondelag region with Nidaros at its center became a stronghold of Sverre. King Magnus continued the fight after the death of his father and refused several offers from Sverre to divide the kingdom between them. Sverre's saga, which was written by Sverre's supporters, makes much of how popular Magnus was among the common people and how this made Sverre's fight against him all the more difficult. The war between Sverre and Magnus raged on for several years, and Magnus at one point had to seek refuge in Denmark. The Battle of Ephemeral, a final naval battle during 1184 in the Sogne Fjord, resulted in the death of King Magnus and victory for King Sverre. Sverre was to rule Norway until 1202, but was unable to achieve long periods of peace. The Church, allied to King Magnus and Erling Skakke, remained virulent in its opposition to Sverre throughout his reign. In 1190 the Archbishop Erik of Aarhus fled the country, and in 1194 he received papal support to excommunicate Sverre and order the country's remaining bishops to join him in exile in Denmark, which they did. By then Sverre had been able to coerce one of his strongest opponents, Bishop Nicholas Andersen of Oslo, to crown him in Bergen in 1194. In 1198 Pope Innocent III placed Norway under interdict. Although Sverre forged letters to show that his excommunication had been lifted, he in fact remained excommunicated until his death. Several pretenders arose to challenge Sverre. Among the most serious was John Kuvlung, a purported son of King Inge Crouchback. He was named king in 1185 and killed in battle in Bergen 3 years later. Sigurd Magnusson, an illegitimate son of King Magnus Ellingson, was proclaimed to be king in 1193 at the Haugating near Tunsberg. Aged 13, Sigurd was a figurehead leader. He had the support of, among others, Harald Madadsson. His rising ended after his defeat and death at the Battle of Florvag near Askøy, an island just north of Bergen, in 1194. Rising of the Bagler. In 1197 the most serious challenge to Sverre's kingdom arose. Several prominent opponents of Sverre, including Bishop Nicholas Ellingson of Oslo, who was a half-brother of King Inge Crouchback, and Archbishop Erik of Aarhus, met at the marketplace of Halle in Skane, then part of Denmark. They took a boy called Inge Magnusson, purported son of King Magnus Ellingson, as the figurehead king. The party was called the Bagler, from an Old Norse word meaning crozier. The war between the Bagler, with the open support of the church, and the Birkebeiner was to last for the rest of Sverre's reign. They were not able to depose Sverre, but neither was he able to win a decisive victory against them. When Sverre died from disease in Bergen in 1202, he was the first king of Norway to die of natural causes since King Sigurd the Crusader in 1130. His last act was to advise his son and heir, Haakon Sverresson, to achieve a settlement with the church. Haakon was taken to be the Birkebeiner's new king, and the bishops returned to Norway later the same year, releasing the country from the interdict. Deprived of most of his support, the Bagler king Inge was killed the same year. The Second Bagler War and the settlement of Kvitsøy. Haakon Sverresson appeared to have pacified the whole country, but died suddenly in 1204. His successor was the infant Guttorm, who himself died later the same year. The Birkebeiner knew of no other direct descendants of King Sverre and chose one of his nephews, Ingebardsson, as the new king. By then a revived Bagler party had formed in Denmark, taking another son of King Magnus Ellingson, Erling as the king. Helped by King Valdemar II of Denmark, they launched an invasion of Norway in 1204, taking control of the Oslofjord area. This Second Bagler War lasted until 1208. When Erling fell ill and died in 1207, he was succeeded as Bagler king by Philippus Simonsen, a nephew of King Inge Crouchback and Bishop Nicholas of Oslo, and the war continued uninterrupted. The Bagler were strongest in the Oslofjord area, while Trondelag was a stronghold of the Birkebeiner. But battles and ambushes took place throughout the country. In the end the bishops were able to negotiate a settlement between the two sides, confirmed at a meeting at Kvitsøy in 1208. The Bagler king Philippus was to remain in control of eastern Norway but renounced the title of king, leaving the Birkebeiner king Inge nominally sole ruler of the country. In the event, Philippus continued to style himself king until his death, but peace between the Bagler and Birkebeiner was preserved until 1217. Reconciliation between Bagler and Birkebeiner. In 1217 King Ingebardsson died. The Birkebeiner, nervous at being left without a leader in case of a Bagler attack, chose the 13-year-old Haakon Haakonssen as the new king, while the Jarl Skalbardsson was made leader of the army. Haakon Haakonssen was a posthumously born son of Haakon Sverresson, of whom the Birkebeiner had not been aware when electing Inge the king in 1204. He had arrived at King Inge's court in 1206. Skuld was the brother of King Inge and had designs on the throne for himself. However, he contented himself for the time being with leadership of the army, which made him, de facto, the most powerful man of the kingdom. When the Bagler king Philippus died later the same year, Skuld moved quickly. He managed to persuade the Bagler not to elect a new king of their own. Instead, they officially dissolved the party and swore fealty to Haakon Haakonssen, thus reuniting the kingdom. Discontented elements remained and a revolt in eastern Norway, led by a son of Erling called Sigurd Ribbung, dragged on until 1227. After Sigurd died a natural death, the rest of his party gave up the revolt. The year 1227 is sometimes considered the end of the Civil War era, but most often the term is extended to include the revolt of Skalbardsson in 1239–40. The election of Haakon as king in 1217 seems to have been considered something of a temporary solution until a permanent arrangement could be reached, and Skuld undoubtedly hoped that he would soon take over the throne. At a gathering of the most important men of the kingdom in Bergen in 1223, Skuld launched his candidacy to the throne of Norway in opposition to Haakon, along with Sigurd, Ellingson, Ribung and 2 other pretenders. However, the meeting ended with Haakon being confirmed as king. As Haakon grew up and gradually took the reins of power into his own hands, Skuld's position steadily declined. In an attempt at preserving the peace between the two, Haakon married Skuld's daughter Margaret in 1225. In 1237 Skuld was given the title of Duke, the first time the title was used in Norway. This was not sufficient to placate him, and in 1239 he had himself declared King of Norway and launched a war against King Haakon. His revolt was unsuccessful, and in 1240 he was killed by King Haakon's men after seeking refuge in a monastery in Nidaros. The Civil War era was at an end. Views on the Civil Wars. Contemporary views. Civil wars and internal strife in royal families was a common occurrence in the Middle Ages, in Norway as well as in other countries of Europe. However, there are examples that contemporary people also viewed the period as special, different from what had gone before. Theodoricus the monk, who wrote a history of Norway in Latin c. 1180, ended his narrative with the death of King Sigurd the Crusader in 1130 as he considered it, utterly unfitting to record for posterity the crimes, killings, perjuries, parricides, desecration of holy places, the contempt for God, the plundering no less of the clergy than of the whole people, the abductions of women and other abominations which it would take long to enumerate, which had occurred since then. The English historian William of Newburgh, writing c. 1200, writes of Norway that, for more than a century back, although the succession of kings that had been rapid, yet none of them had ended his days by age or sickness, but all had perished by the sword, leaving the dignity of empire to their assassins as the lawful successors, so that, indeed, the expression, "Hast thou killed, and also taken possession?" may seem to apply to all who reigned there for so long a space of time. Modern views. Modern historians have put forward many views and explanations of the Civil War era. The contemporary sources, the sagas, strongly emphasize the personal nature of the conflicts. Wars arose as a result of the struggle between different people for the possession of the throne, the unclear succession laws, and the practice of power sharing between several kings simultaneously, gave personal conflicts the potential to become full-blown wars. More recently, historian Arve Bjorgo has suggested that the practice of power sharing was actually a good way of governing the kingdom in the first period after its unification, and that tendencies towards centralization and a unitary kingdom were important factors in triggering the wars. Edward Bull has also emphasized geographical animosities as a factor, pointing to the fact that different pretenders often found the main support in certain parts of the country. Also important was the involvement of foreign powers. Danish and, to a lesser extent, Swedish kings were always ready to lend the support to factions in the Norwegian wars, with an eye to extending their own influence, particularly in the Viken area. A popular explanation in early Norwegian historiography was a conflict between the royal power and the aristocracy. According to this view, by historians such as Piemont J. E. Sars and Gustav Storm, the aristocracy saw the king as a tool by which they governed the country. Consequently, they supported weak kings but were eventually beaten by the strong kings of The same views are expounded concerning the involvement of the church. These explanations lost credence as it became clear that the Lendmen seemed to be evenly split on different sides, both before and after King Sigurd. Sverre himself even had some of the Lendmen on his side. Knut has emphasized how the church, after Sverre's death, seemed to work hard to bring about reconciliation between warring parties, and stability. Towards the middle of the 20th century, historical materialism gained much popularity in Norwegian historiography. Its proponents, e.g., Edward Bull and Andreas Holmsen, sought to explain the civil wars on a social and economic basis. They assumed that Norwegian society became more stratified in the 12th century, with large groups of previously self-owning farmers sinking to the status of tenant farmers, while the Lendmen and the church amassed great landholdings. This created conflicts which found an outlet in the civil wars. There is also an assumption that certain regions, such as Trøndelag and inner parts of eastern Norway, were more egalitarian and therefore opposed the more stratified regions of the country. These attempts to introduce a form of class struggle explanation to the conflicts have lost ground more recently, as they seem to have little foundation in the sources. It has not been possible to show empirically that an increased stratification of society in fact took place at all in this period. Indeed, recent studies seem to indicate that this was not the case. Knut emphasizes the steady strengthening of royal power throughout the Civil War era. When the period ended, the concept of a unitary kingdom had been accepted. The beginnings of a centralized administration had appeared and the king's power had increased so that a strong king would be able to contain social and geographical splits without them leading to open war. In this perspective, the civil wars can be seen as the final phase in the unification of Norway into one kingdom. List of kings and pretenders during the Civil War era. Pretenders who had themselves named king, but are not counted in the official line of kings, are written in italics. Magnus the Blind, Harald Giles Sigurd Slembe, 1135–1139, Sigurd Munn, Inge Crouchback, Øystein Haraldsson, Haakon the Broad-Shouldered, Magnus Ellingson, Sigurd Markas Fuster, Olav Ugjarava, Øystein Mæler, 1174–1177. Sverre Sigurdsson, John Kuvlung, Sigurd Magnusson, Inger Magnusson, 1196–1202. Haakon Sverresson, Guttorm Sigurdsson, Inger Bardsson, Erling Stonewall, Philippus Simonsson, 1207–1217. Haakon Håkonsson, Sigurd Rebung, P. Knut Håkonsson, Skull Bardsson, 1239–1240.